Okay, let's start. Number 1. Actun Tunichil Muknal. You're wading through cold, waist-deep water into the mouth of a limestone cave in the Tapir Mountain Reserve of Belize, headlamp cutting a narrow beam through total darkness. The name translates to Cave of the Stone Sepulchre, and it earns that name a half-mile in, past a boulder-choked passage and an underground river you have to swim, in a chamber the ancient Maya believed was a physical entrance to Xibalba, the underworld. Archaeologist Jaime O led the systematic study of the cave beginning in the 1990s, after its 1989 rediscovery, and what his teams documented deep inside had been sitting undisturbed, exactly as it was left, for well over 1,000 years. According to the Popol Vuh, the Maya's own sacred text, Xibalba was not an abstract afterlife. It was ruled by named lords, 1 death and 7 death among them. Beings who tested and tormented anyone who entered their domain through elaborate, deliberately engineered houses of horror. A house of blades, a house of cold, a house of jaguars, a house of fire, and a house of bats, each staffed by its own class of underworld demon, whose sole function was to torment and kill. The text does not describe them as symbols. It describes them as bodies. Skeletal torsos with the flesh sloughing from exposed rib bone, distended stomachs marked with the black circles of disease, joints that bend backward at the knee and elbow, faces with no lips at all, only a permanent barred row of teeth. Surviving classic period painted vessels from the wider Maya world depict these exact features on figures art historians have matched directly to the Xibalba lords described in the text, meaning the physical description isn't a modern invention layered onto old myth. It was painted, consistently, by people who insisted they knew what these beings looked like. This wasn't metaphorical to the people who carved the cave's ritual spaces. It was geography, and the geography had a face. Here's what makes archaeologists uncomfortable. Deep inside the cave, past a climb up a rock face, lies a terminal chamber containing the skeletal remains of at least 14 individuals, most showing trauma consistent with ritual sacrifice rather than natural death or accident. The most complete skeleton, a teenager researchers named the Crystal Maiden, lies exactly where she fell, her bones now calcified into the cave floor itself, centuries of mineral-rich water fusing them to the rock until they glitter under artificial light like something no longer entirely human remains. Her spine shows a fracture pattern consistent with a specific method of sacrifice. She was never buried, never wrapped, never given any of the funerary care the Maya extended to their honored dead elsewhere. She was left for something else entirely. Ceramic vessels found throughout the site show a pattern archaeologists call killing. Deliberately punched holes or intentional breakage before the object was placed, a Maya ritual practice meant to release the object's spirit so it could accompany the offering into the underworld alongside it. Radiocarbon and stylistic dating cluster the heaviest concentration of sacrifice activity around the terminal classic period, roughly 800 to 900 CE, precisely the window during which the wider Maya world was collapsing under sustained drought. The mainstream explanation holds that elites, desperate to restore agricultural order, escalated ritual offerings to placate the gods believed responsible for the crisis. That explanation doesn't address why this specific cave, this specific dark, wet, dangerous stretch of geography nearly impossible to reach, was chosen as the place worth risking human lives to access, again and again, for generations, rather than any of the accessible surface temples built for exactly this purpose. The cave was sealed from ordinary human presence for over 1,000 years after the sacrifices stopped. No later Maya generation returned to disturb it. No looters found it across a millennium of opportunity, in a region where looting has stripped nearly every other accessible site bare. It sat exactly as its last visitors left it, remains in place, offerings unbroken by time, until a hunter accidentally rediscovered the entrance in 1989. Why did a civilization capable of building visible, monumental temples choose instead to send its dead into total darkness, past a river, past a climb, to leave them for beings its own sacred text describes as named, individual, and actively hostile? Why does the Crystal Maiden's body show no burial preparation at all, only abandonment exactly where death occurred? And why did an entire culture's access to this specific chamber stop, all at once, precisely when the sacrifices did? The bones are still fusing to the floor. Nobody has moved them. From the cave beneath Belize, we travel north to the Nevada desert, where a different people told a story about who came before them, and in 1911, miners dug directly into the middle of it. Number 2. Lovelock Cave. You're in the Nevada desert in 1911, above the dried basin of ancient Lake Lahontan, and two guano miners named John and Dave Hart are blasting and shoveling their way through a cave they intend to strip for fertilizer. What they hid instead, buried under layers of bat and bird droppings accumulated over roughly 4,000 years of intermittent human use, is a sealed record of the people who lived there before them, and a set of remains that would attach themselves to a story local tribes had already been telling for generations before any miner arrived. The Northern Paiute oral tradition surrounding this cave was recorded in writing decades earlier by Paiute author Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins in her 1883 memoir, one of the first books published in English by a Native American woman. She described the CTCAA in specific physical terms: red-haired, standing well over 6 feet, with a heavier, thicker bone structure than the surrounding peoples, and a reported tolerance for cold and perpassion. Darkness that let them move through the cave systems of the region without light or fire. Cannibalistic according to the tradition, and violent. They warred with her ancestors for years before a coalition of tribes finally cornered the last of them inside this exact cave, piled brush across the entrance, and set it alight, killing everyone trapped inside by fire and smoke. Winnemucca's family and community treated this not as folklore but as literal tribal history, a specific named event, with a specific physical description of the people involved, tied to a specific place. Here's what makes anthropologists uncomfortable about the timing. The Hart brothers' 1911 excavation was crude and destructive, removing an estimated 10,000 tons of guano before any archaeologist reached the site, but what survived the mining included genuinely remarkable material. Woven baskets, textiles, and a set of Tula red duck decoys later radiocarbon dated to roughly 2,000 years old, the oldest confirmed decoys ever found anywhere on Earth, now held in the Nevada State Museum. The site's real archaeological value is not in dispute. What is contested is what else came out of that cave in 1911, before proper documentation existed to track it. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the period describe skeletal remains removed during the mining operation as unusually large, skulls with a heavier brow ridge and a noticeably thicker cranial wall than ordinary human remains, long bones outside typical human proportions, some reportedly wrapped in reddish hair still attached at the scalp when they were pulled from the guano. That material was forwarded for further examination to outside institutions, including references to specimens sent toward the Smithsonian Institution. Those specific remains have never been publicly relocated. No outside researcher has been permitted to independently re-examine the exact material period witnesses described handling. What sits in accessible Nevada collections today is a different, smaller set of bones entirely, and no public record explains where the rest of what left that cave in 1911 actually went. The cave's geography adds a detail rarely mentioned outside specialist literature. Lovelock Cave sits at the edge of what was, thousands of years ago, the shoreline of Lake Lahontan, a vast Ice Age inland sea covering much of present-day Nevada that has since evaporated down to the much smaller Humboldt Sink, leaving the cave mouth stranded well above any modern water source, high and dry above a landscape that used to be a coastline. Whoever occupied the cave across those 4 millennia adapted to a landscape that changed dramatically underneath them, and the deepest, oldest layers of habitation debris sit closest to the cave's rear chambers, the same general area period accounts associate with the unusual remains. A layer archaeologists have returned to sample more cautiously since the destructive 1911 dig, aware of how much context that first excavation destroyed before anyone thought to record it properly. The Paiute account was specific well before the mining began. Red-haired, unusually large, exterminated by fire in a cave matching this cave's description, its location passed down independent of any archaeological dig, generations before Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins ever set the story on paper for an outside readership to read. Why would an oral tradition specify unusual size and hair color for a people that claims to have wiped out, details with no obvious symbolic purpose, if it were pure invention? Why do contemporary period sources describe handling remains outside ordinary proportions, sourced to this exact excavation, when so much of what those same sources describe elsewhere at the site has since been independently confirmed as genuine? And where, specifically, is the material 1911 witnesses said left this cave in crates bound for further study? The duck decoys sit in a case in Nevada today, authenticated and dated. The remains those same witnesses described are not sitting anywhere anyone can currently point to. From the desert cave in Nevada, we travel south to the Ecuadorian Amazon, to a cave system indigenous shamans have restricted for generations, and where the search for what's inside once included an actual astronaut. Number 3. Cueva de los Tallos. You're being lowered by rope through a sinkhole entrance in the Ecuadorian Amazon, Morona Santiago province, the shriek of nesting oilbirds, the Tallos the cave is named for, echoing up out of total darkness below you. These birds navigate by echolocation, like bats, because they spend their entire lives in a cave system so deep that sunlight never reaches significant portions of it. The Shuar people, an indigenous group with a long, continuous tradition of shamanic practice in this exact region, have restricted entry to specific initiated guides for generations, and they describe what lives in the deeper tunnels in terms that have nothing to do with birds. In 1969, Hungarian-Argentine explorer Juan Morix filed a formal legal claim with the Ecuadorian government asserting he had located a vast underground tunnel network inside the cave system containing what he described as a metal library, engraved plates and tablets arranged with clear intentional structure, a filing that is real and remains on public record in Ecuador regardless of what anyone believes about its contents. Swiss author Erich von Daniken popularized Morex's claim internationally in his 1973 book Gold of the Gods, presenting photographs and interview material suggesting the tunnels showed a geometric regularity inconsistent with natural cave formation, and floated the possibility of non-human construction. The claim detonated into a media sensation. Here's what makes researchers uncomfortable, in two directions at once. Von Daniken admitted in a 1973 interview with the German magazine Stern that he had not personally entered the exact tunnels shown in his own book's photographs. Skeptics seized on that admission as the end of the entire story, proof the whole claim was theater. It wasn't, because in 1976, a large, seriously funded caving expedition actually happened, jointly organized by British and Ecuadorian teams, backed by the British Speleological Expeditionary Society and elements of the Ecuadorian military. Independent of Morix or von Daniken entirely, organizer Stan Hall invited a very specific honorary expedition leader, and astronaut Neil Armstrong accepted, a detail confirmed in expedition records and contemporary press coverage from the period, not a rumor attached after the fact. Nobody recruits a man who had personally stood on the surface of the moon to co-lead a tour of an empty cave. That expedition mapped kilometers of genuine cave system, confirmed the oilbird colonies, and catalogued pottery and ceramic fragments consistent with earlier indigenous use of the upper chambers. It did not locate a metal library or confirm the more extravagant tunnel claims Morix had filed. But large sections of the mapped system remain formally unexplored to this day, and multiple expedition accounts describe Shuar guides declining to lead outside members into specific deeper passages, citing reasons participants recorded only as those sections not being for visitors, without further explanation offered or requested. Later, smaller expeditions in the decades since 1976, with no attachment to Morix's original claims, have gone back hoping simply to finish mapping what the joint expedition left incomplete. Several of those teams have independently reported the same pattern. Local guides willing to lead them through most of the system, and the same handful of specific passages consistently excluded, regardless of which outside team was asking. No expedition log describes what, if anything, lies past those points. Every account simply stops at the same boundary, described the same way, by teams with no reason to coordinate a story. Shuar oral tradition itself, independent of Morix's claims and predating them by generations, describes certain deep sections of the cave system as inhabited by a specific physically described people the tradition calls the ones who live below. Short in stature, pale-skinned from generations without sunlight, with disproportionately large, dark eyes adapted to total darkness, and a documented shamanic account of encountering them near the deeper passage mouths at night, always retreating the instant a light source was raised toward them. The tradition does not treat them as animals or ancestor spirits. It treats them as a distinct, living people who occupy the tunnels below and are not to be disturbed. Why would a legally filed 1969 claim, dismissed by critics over one man's admission, still be followed, 7 years later, by a real, internationally organized expedition, serious enough to recruit a sitting, world-famous American astronaut as its honorary leader? Why do experienced Shuar guides, with no attachment to Morix's story, independently restrict access to specific unmapped passages, using language that treats those sections as occupied rather than simply hazardous. And what, precisely, is still sitting in the sections no outside expedition has ever been permitted to reach? The oilbirds still nest in the dark by the thousands, screeching and echolocating through tunnels that extend past every line anyone has ever mapped. From the cave beneath the Ecuadorian jungle, we travel north to Central Europe, where a different kind of concealment was built not around a chasm in the rock, but out of the bones of the dead themselves. Number 4. Sedlec Ossuary. You're standing inside a small Gothic chapel outside Kutna in the Czech Republic, and every surface around you is built from human bone. Garlands of skulls hang from the ceiling. Chandeliers assembled from what were once living people cast pale light across the room. Estimates place the number of individuals represented here between 40,000 and 70,000. One of the densest concentrations of human remains arranged as architecture anywhere on Earth. This did not happen by accident or gradual accumulation. It happened because something about this specific ground made it the place people wanted their dead buried, no matter the cost of getting them here. The origin traces to 1278, when the abbot of Sedlec was sent to Jerusalem and returned with a handful of soil from Golgotha, the site of the crucifixion, which he scattered across the cemetery grounds. Word spread that the earth itself had been sanctified by contact with the holiest site in Christendom, and within decades the cemetery became one of the most desired burial locations in Central Europe. Then the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, followed by the Hussite Wars in the 15th, and the demand for burial in that specific consecrated soil outpaced the ground itself. Mass graves stacked bodies faster than the earth could hold them, and by the early 1400s, a small chapel was constructed directly over the cemetery, with a lower level built specifically to hold the overflow of bones, exhumed to make room for more burials. Here's what makes historians uncomfortable about what happened next. Sometime in the 14th century, a half-blind Cistercian monk was assigned the task of exhuming and stacking the accumulated bones inside the ossuary, a job that would occupy years of a single man's life in a windowless chamber full of the dead. Local oral tradition, passed down through Kutna long before the chapel became a tourist attraction, describes the monk reporting a presence in the ossuary during his work, something he never named directly but consistently described as tall, unnaturally pale, and wrong in its proportions, moving silently between the stacks at the edges of his vision when the light was low. The tradition doesn't frame this as ghost story embellishment. It frames the monk's task as containment work, keeping something organized and settled that the sheer accumulated weight of death on that ground had stirred loose. The ossuary's own consecration records use language uncommon in standard church ossuary charters of the period. Phrasing scholars studying the original Latin have noted reads closer to binding, or settling, than the routine language typically used for consecrating burial ground. 19th century visitors to the site, decades before woodcarver František Rint's famous 1870 rearrangement of the bones into the chandeliers and garlands seen today, reported unexplained cold spots concentrated near the chamber's rear wall and a silence visitors described as pressing rather than simply quiet, sensations recorded in personal letters and travel journals independent of each other. Rint's renovation is documented fact. What isn't as easily explained is why. For the roughly 4 centuries before he arrived, the chamber was kept closed to general parish use, rather than opened for ordinary veneration, typically extended to consecrated ossuaries elsewhere in Europe. Rint himself, according to accounts from workers who assisted him, insisted on a specific arrangement for the largest garland strung above the nave, one that later observers noted forms a pattern easily read, from the right vantage point, as a coiled, watching shape rather than a purely decorative loop. Rint left no written explanation for why he chose that particular design over the simpler geometric patterns common in other European ossuaries of the same era. The bones he used to build it were never inventoried by individual identity. No record exists of whose remains form which fixture, meaning the specific bones the monk once described disturbing centuries earlier are, structurally speaking, somewhere in that chapel today, reassembled into the very architecture visitors now walk beneath, without knowing which garland was once a person, the half-blind monk, spent years trying to keep settled. Why did a monastery choose to build an entire chapel specifically to house overflow remains, rather than simply expanding the cemetery outward? Why does the monk's account, preserved independently across generations of local memory, so consistently describe something with a shape rather than nothing at all? Why does the ossuary's own consecration language lean toward containment rather than the standard rites used everywhere else? And why does the largest garland in the room still read, from the right angle, as something coiled and watching rather than simply decorative? The bones are still stacked exactly as Rint arranged them, and the chamber is still closed after dark. From the bone chapel in Central Europe, we travel east to India, where a different kind of containment was carved not from remains, but downward through solid rock, with no room anywhere in the process for a single mistake. Number 5. The Kailasa Temple at Ellora. You're standing in a rectangular pit carved into a basalt hillside in Maharashtra, India, and above you rises a complete, multi-story temple, courtyards, bridges, life-size stone elephants, and a central shrine, all of it a single, continuous piece of the mountain itself. No blocks were quarried and stacked to build this. No mortar holds any of it together. The entire structure was carved downward and inward out of solid rock, meaning every wall, every pillar, every carved elephant was subtractive from the very first cut, removed rather than assembled. Conventional dating places construction under the Rashtrakuta dynasty, largely credited to King Krishna I, in the 8th century CEE. Engineers who have studied the site estimate roughly 200,000 tons of solid basalt were removed to produce the finished temple, excavated entirely from the top down, meaning the builders had to plan the complete finished form, including doorways, interior chambers, and roof-level carving, before removing a single block from what would eventually become open interior space. Consider what that requires. In additive construction, a mistake means adjusting the next course of stone. Here, a miscalculated cut removes material that cannot be put back. The entire structure, top to bottom, had to exist as a complete plan in someone's mind before the first strike of the chisel, with zero tolerance for correction anywhere in a project of that scale. Here's what makes structural engineers uncomfortable. Multiple surveys of the site have failed to identify any significant error correction marks anywhere in the temple, no patched sections, no abandoned false starts, no evidence of the kind of trial and error scarring typically found on large-scale hand-carved monuments from the ancient world. For a project removing 200,000 tons of rock with Iron Age hand tools over a construction period modern estimates place at multiple generations, the absence of visible correction across the entire structure has no comfortable explanation within standard two-land labor models. Either the plan was executed with a precision current experimental archaeology cannot replicate, or something about the process worked differently than hand chisel subtraction alone can account for. The temple's foundational carvings aren't incidental. The entire structure is explicitly modeled on Mount Kailash itself, the real Himalayan peak sacred across multiple traditions, and its bas reliefs depict the 10-headed demon king Ravana attempting to lift the mountain in a fit of rage, only to be pinned beneath its shifting weight by Shiva's downward pressure until Ravana relents and is released. This is not a myth about defeating and destroying a non-human being. It's a myth about physically containing one beneath solid stone, using overwhelming weight as the mechanism, carved into the exact foundation of a temple built using the same principle of removing rather than adding material. Guardian yaksha figures positioned at key structural points throughout the temple show proportions inconsistent with any human reference, elongated torsos, disproportionate limbs, and facial features multiple art historians have described as deliberately unsettling rather than stylized. Local temple tradition, predating the Rashtrakuta construction, according to regional oral history, holds that the mountain location was already considered inhabited, not merely suitable, before any carving began, and that the temple's specific design was chosen because the site itself required a structure heavy enough and precise enough to hold. The Ellora Cave complex surrounding Kailasa contains more than 30 additional rock-cut monuments, Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain, carved across several centuries by different traditions working the same hillside. Kailasa's excavation cuts directly through material shared with several neighboring caves, meaning the builders had to account for the structural integrity of monuments that weren't theirs while removing 200,000 tons of surrounding rock, a level of coordinated planning across religious lines that has no clean administrative explanation in the historical record of the period. Some sections of the temple's upper galleries, accessible only by narrow internal stairways, remain closed to general visitors today, officially for structural preservation, though site conservators have never published a specific engineering report identifying which load-bearing concern justifies the restriction over any other section of the exposed structure. Why does a civilization with Iron Age tools achieve a zero margin for error carving project at a scale modern engineers still study for its precision without a single documented failed attempt anywhere nearby? Why is the temple's central myth specifically about pinning a multi-headed non-human king beneath stone rather than defeating him outright? And why did local tradition insist the site was already inhabited before the first cut was made? The temple still stands exactly where the mountain used to be, hollowed from the inside, holding its shape. From the carved mountain in India, we travel to Scotland, where a family sealed a much smaller vault rather than let anyone confirm what its carvings actually meant. Number 6. Rosslyn Chapel. You're standing inside the nave of a small collegiate chapel outside Edinburgh, Scotland, looking up at a ceiling covered in stone carvings so dense that no two visitors seem to notice the same details first. Over 100 carved green man faces, foliate figures with vegetation growing from their mouths and eyes, stare down from the architecture. Rows of cube-shaped stone pendants, arranged in patterns some researchers have argued encode musical notation, cover an entire section of the ceiling in a design found nowhere else in medieval European architecture. William Sinclair began construction in 1446, and by the time it was finished, the chapel's carvers had covered nearly every surface with imagery that has never been fully catalogued to universal agreement, let alone explained. Here's what makes botanists uncomfortable. Among the dense plant carvings covering the interior, several have been identified by specialists as depictions of maize, the corn plant native exclusively to the Americas, and what appears to be aloe cactus, another plant with no documented presence in Europe before contact with the New World. Christopher Columbus's first voyage didn't reach the Americas until 1492, decades after Rosslyn's construction began, and after most of its interior carving was reportedly complete under the mainstream timeline. Conventional explanations range from misidentified European plant species to speculative claims of undocumented pre-Columbian transatlantic contact by the Sinclair family or their associates. Neither explanation has achieved consensus. The carvings remain on the ceiling regardless of which explanation anyone prefers. Beneath the chapel lies a crypt that has been sealed since at least the 18th century by explicit instruction from the Sinclair family, and it has never been formally excavated using modern archaeological methods. Family correspondence from the period, preserved in Scottish historical archives, describes the space and language translators have rendered as not for opening, phrasing distinct from the routine privacy language typically used for family burial vaults elsewhere in Scotland. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted at the site during the 2010s detected a previously unmapped void space beneath the known crypt level, along with what appears to be a descending stairway leading further down than any documented plan of the chapel accounts for. The survey results were published, generated public interest, and were followed by no announced excavation. Local tradition insists the sealed space below should remain below, a belief that predates the radar surveys by generations, and that the Sinclair family itself, according to accounts from chapel staff, has never publicly contradicted or clarified. 19th century accounts of previous, smaller excavation attempts near the crypt entrance describe workers abandoning the effort after reporting sudden, unexplained illness, a detail dismissed at the time as damp air and poor ventilation. Though no formal medical record from the period survives to confirm the diagnosis one way or the other. The chapel's association with the Knights Templar and their successor Freemason traditions has fueled centuries of speculation that the sealed crypt holds something the order specifically wanted protected rather than simply buried. Sinclair himself was connected to hereditary offices within early Scottish Freemasonry, and the chapel's carving program was overseen personally, according to surviving construction records, rather than delegated to an outside master mason. An unusual level of direct involvement for a project of this scale, and the carvings themselves seem to know where the threshold is. Multiple visitors and researchers cataloging the Green Man faces have independently noted that the figures grow more numerous and more distorted. Elongated features, asymmetrical expressions, mouths pulled unnaturally wide and lined with teeth carved individually, rather than as a single decorative row, the closer their position sits to the section of floor above the detected void. Family accounts passed privately among Sinclair descendants, according to interviews chapel staff have given over the years, describe those specific carvings not as generic foliate ornament, but as a likeness, copied from a description handed down inside the family of exactly what the crypt was built to hold. A lean, elongated figure, skin the color and texture of old stone, a mouth that opens far wider than the proportions of its face should allow. As though the carvers weren't decorating a ceiling, they were leaving a description. Why does a 15th century Scottish chapel contain plant carvings of species with no known European presence before Columbus reached the Americas? Why has a family maintained an unbroken, centuries-old instruction to leave a specific space beneath their own chapel permanently sealed rather than simply locking a door? And why do the carvings meant to ward off evil multiply and distort specifically near the one part of the building nobody is allowed to enter? The void the radar found is still there, unexplored, exactly where the most distorted faces point. From the sealed vault in Scotland, we cross to France, to a well far older than the cathedral built directly over it, dug specifically to hold something the ground couldn't be trusted to keep on its own. Number 7. The Well of the Strong Ones. You're descending into the crypt beneath one of the most celebrated Gothic cathedrals in France, cold stone pressing in around you, and at the center of the floor sits the mouth of a deep well, its bottom lost in darkness. The French call it Puits des Saints Forts, the Well of the Strong Saints, but the site is older than any saint associated with it. It predates the Gothic cathedral above by centuries, predates the earlier Romanesque church on the same spot, and traces back to a pre-Roman Gallic sacred site that occupied this exact ground long before Christianity reached the region. Medieval chroniclers writing about Chartres recorded a persistent local tradition describing an ancient carved figure venerated at the site before Christianity's arrival. A seated female form, dark in material, associated with a legend the chroniclers translated as Virgo Paratura, the virgin who will give birth, a title and image local tradition insisted predated any knowledge of the events it seemed to foretell. Church authorities, rather than dismissing the pre-Christian figure as pagan superstition to be erased, incorporated its legend directly into the cathedral's own founding mythology, an unusual choice for institutions that typically worked to erase, not absorb, competing sacred narratives. The original statue itself was destroyed by revolutionary forces in 1793, and no detailed physical documentation of it survives, meaning the object at the center of the tradition can now only be reconstructed from written description. Here's what makes architectural historians uncomfortable. Cathedral floor plans are typically organized around the altar and the liturgical east end as the building's structural and symbolic center. At Chartres, the well sits almost precisely beneath the cathedral's central crossing, the point where the nave and transept intersect, an architectural decision that required the building's entire footprint to be planned around a pre-existing hole in the ground rather than the reverse. No surviving construction record explains why the builders chose to preserve and build directly around the well's exact position, instead of relocating either the well's access point or the crossing itself, a far simpler solution available to any architect of the period. Local legend, distinct from the sanctioned church narrative involving the Virgo Paratura, holds a separate and older tradition about the well's original function, one still referenced obliquely in regional folklore collected by 19th century French folklorists. It describes the well as having been used to dispose of the remains of those who encountered what the tradition calls les forts, the strong ones, a term applied specifically to entities the folklore treats as distinct from human martyrs or saints, despite the well's later sanctified name. Most surviving accounts refuse to describe them directly, treating the description itself as dangerous to repeat. A handful of marginal notes made by those same 19th century folklorists, transcribed from elderly informants whose own oral sources reached back generations further, break that pattern. Tall, gaunt figures, skin described as the gray of wet clay, limbs proportioned noticeably longer than a human frame should allow, encountered near the well's edge at specific hours and never for more than a few seconds before they were gone. The accounts describe the aftermath in more detail than the beings themselves, and the specific instruction, repeated across multiple independent regional sources, that whatever went into the well afterward was not to be brought back up. Excavations conducted in the crypt during the 19th century, aimed at clarifying the well's original depth and construction date, were reportedly halted before reaching the bottom, with period accounts citing unstable groundwater as the official reason for stopping. The well's true depth has never been independently confirmed since. Stone fragments recovered from the upper fill layers during that same excavation, catalogued at the time but since lost from the cathedral's own archive, were described in period notes as bearing carved marks unlike any known Gallic or Roman symbol from the region. A detail mentioned once and never followed up on before the fragments disappeared from record. The crypt area immediately surrounding the well remains restricted from general public cathedral tours today, accessible only on guided visits with limited access to the well's actual opening, a restriction cathedral authorities attribute to structural preservation of one of the oldest surviving elements of the site. Why would a Gothic cathedral's entire footprint be planned around preserving direct access to a pre-Christian well rather than simply building over and sealing it? Why did church authorities choose to absorb, rather than erase, the well's older legend into the cathedral's own founding story? Who or what are Les Forts, named specifically as something other than the human dead? And why did a 19th century excavation stop short of the bottom, citing groundwater, and never resume? The well is still open at the bottom of that crypt, still descending past where anyone has mapped it. From the well beneath Charters, we travel to Japan, to a shrine where the concealment isn't a hole in the ground at all. It's a wall no living person, including the nation's own emperor, is permitted to see past. Number 8. Ise Grand Shrine. You're standing outside the innermost fence line of Neku, the inner shrine, at Ise in Japan, and beyond the wooden walls in front of you is a space no documented living person, not tourist, not scholar, not even the reigning emperor of Japan under current practice, is permitted to see directly. Multiple concentric wooden fences separate the outer approach from the shrine's central sanctuary, each layer restricting access further, until only a small, specific hereditary line of Shinto priests and priestesses may pass the final threshold. The shrine is dedicated to Amaterasu, the sun deity central to Shinto tradition, described within that tradition not as an abstract symbol, but as a being who descended to establish the imperial line directly. A non-human origin built explicitly into the foundation of the country's oldest continuous institution. Housed within the sanctuary is the Yata no Kagami, one of Japan's 3 sacred imperial treasures alongside a sword and a jewel, together forming the regalia said to have been given directly by Amaterasu to the imperial line at its founding. The mirror's physical form has never been officially confirmed by any documented modern viewing. No photograph exists. No detailed physical description has ever been released through official channels, despite the object's central importance to the imperial institution for well over 1,000 years. Here's what makes historians and Shinto scholars uncomfortable, each for different reasons. The entire shrine complex is not preserved in its original ancient form the way most religious monuments are. Instead, it is completely rebuilt from scratch every 20 years, a ritual called Shikinen Sengu, with exacting replication of every measurement and construction technique, maintained continuously since at least 690 CE. Nothing physically ancient remains standing at Ise today. Only the pattern survives, transmitted with exact precision across roughly 62 consecutive rebuildings, unbroken through civil wars, foreign occupation, and the complete modernization of the country around it. Access beyond the outer fences has remained restricted to imperial priests and priestesses of a specific hereditary line for the entire recorded history of the shrine. Even the emperor, within Shinto tradition, a descendant of Amaterasu himself, does not personally view the innermost sanctuary's contents according to documented modern practice, a restriction that holds even for the one person whose ancestral claim to the site is most direct. Priests serving closest to the sanctuary are bound to specific ritual purification requirements before approach, and none who have served in that role have ever publicly described what lies beyond the final fence. Several accounts from priestly families, passed down rather than published, describe a specific physical sensation reported near the innermost fence during the transfer ritual, a pressure in the ears, and an unwillingness in the body to move closer. Described consistently enough across unrelated family lines that shrine staff have a private term for it, never translated for outside publication. The Yata no Kagami itself has an origin story within Shinto myth that reads less like allegory than record. Amaterasu, angered and grieving, withdrew into a cave, plunging the world into darkness, and was drawn back out only when other deities hung the mirror outside, and she caught sight of her own reflection, mistaking the light for another being as bright as herself, curious enough to step forward. The oldest surviving temple commentaries describe her, on that occasion and elsewhere, not an ordinary human shape at all. A column of light with a human silhouette only barely visible inside it, no fixed face, features that shift depending on the angle from which she is described being seen, an appearance multiple independent texts insist is not decoration but simply what she is. The myth describes the mirror not as a passive object, but as something capable of holding and returning a presence of exactly that kind, a detail Shinto scholars have long treated as purely symbolic and local shrine tradition has, according to several accounts collected from priestly families over generations, treated with considerably more caution. The two other imperial treasures, the sword and the jewel, are housed separately from the mirror at different shrines entirely. A separation, some scholars argue, was designed to prevent any single location, or any single person, from holding the complete set at once. Why would an institution maintain a rebuilding ritual with such exacting, unbroken precision for over 1,300 years if the goal were simply architectural preservation, something far more easily achieved by not rebuilding at all? Why has the central sacred object's physical form never been confirmed by a single documented modern witness willing to describe it? And what does it mean that the one person with the most direct ancestral claim to the deity housed there has still never been permitted to look? The fences are still standing exactly where they've always stood, and the 13th century line to look inside them has never once been crossed and reported. From the shrine no one may enter, we travel to Tibet, to a mountain that four entirely separate religious traditions independently agree no human is permitted to climb at all. Number 9. Mount Kailash. You're standing at the base of a near-perfectly symmetrical peak on the high Tibetan plateau. Prayer flags snapping in air so thin it burns your lungs on the climb up to base camp alone. Kailash rises 21,778 feet, technically modest compared to the true giants of the Himalayan range, well within the climbing ability of experienced mountaineers who have summited far harder peaks on every other continent. And yet, in the entire recorded history of mountaineering, no confirmed human ascent to its summit exists. Not one. For a mountain this technically approachable, that absence is, on its own, statistically strange. Here's what makes religious historians uncomfortable in a very specific way. Kailash is considered sacred, simultaneously and independently, by four entirely separate religious traditions. Hinduism, which venerates it as the literal abode of Shiva Buddhism, which associates it with the deity Demchok. Jainism, which reveres it as the site where the first Jain spiritual teacher achieved liberation, and the indigenous Bon tradition of Tibet, which holds it sacred independent of any of the other three. These traditions share no common origin, developed across different centuries and regions, and disagree on nearly everything else about the nature of the divine. On the single question of whether human beings should stand on that particular summit, all four arrived, independently, at the same answer. In 2001, Chinese authorities, who administer the region, formally banned climbing attempts on Kailash following coordinated international pressure from representatives of all four traditions simultaneously. A nearly unprecedented moment of unified religious consensus across faiths that otherwise share little common ground and, in some regional contexts, active historical tension. The ban held even against expedition groups that had already secured prior permits and funding, several of which were cancelled at the government's direct intervention, rather than the climber's own choice. The mountain's physical geometry has drawn its own separate scrutiny. Kailash's four faces align unusually close to true cardinal directions, and its overall symmetry, stepped, near pyramidal in profile from multiple angles, has led some researchers to argue the formation resembles engineered structure more than typical glacial or tectonic peak erosion. Mainstream geologists attribute the shape to natural faceting from ancient glacial action combined with the specific mineral composition of the rock, and no formal geological survey has concluded otherwise. The visual resemblance, whatever its cause, remains striking enough that it appears in nearly every photograph of the mountain without needing to be pointed out. Local Tibetan tradition doesn't describe Kailash as merely sacred ground, the way a temple or shrine might be. It describes the mountain as inhabited, actively, in the present tense, not a historical dwelling place but a current one, and warns specifically that anyone reaching the summit would return changed, if they returned at all. The mountain sits within a broader landscape tradition, treats as equally significant, ringed by four rivers considered the sources of some of Asia's major waterways, and by Lake Manasaravar, the highest freshwater lake of its size on Earth, itself considered a mirror to the mountain's sacred function rather than a separate feature. Pilgrims from all four traditions perform a ritual circuit around the base of Kailash rather than attempting the summit, a 32-mile trek some devout practitioners complete through repeated full-body prostrations across the entire distance. That intensity of ritual circling rather than ascent is itself unusual. Most sacred mountains eventually accumulate some sanctioned form of summit pilgrimage. Kailash never has. Not in any tradition, at any point in its recorded religious history. Several 20th century expeditions, composed of experienced climbers who had successfully summited comparable or harder peaks elsewhere, independently abandoned their attempts on Kailash well below the top. They cited disorientation, altered perception of time, and physical distress. Climbing physiologists, reviewing the accounts afterward, could not attribute the symptoms to the route's actual technical difficulty or altitude alone, given how routinely climbers manage equivalent conditions elsewhere without incident. More than one account from these turn-back expeditions describes the same specific detail, offered independently and without prompting. A tall, upright shape glimpsed at distance against the snow, visible for a few seconds through cloud break, gone the moment binoculars or a camera lens was raised toward it. None of these climbers claimed to have seen it clearly. All of them described turning back within the hour. Why would four unconnected religious traditions, with different gods, different scriptures, and different histories, independently arrive at the exact same summit prohibition? What does inhabited mean, specifically, in a tradition that otherwise freely distinguishes between sacred ground and occupied ground everywhere else on the map? And why have experienced climbers, capable of handling the mountain's actual technical demands, repeatedly turned back reporting symptoms with no accepted physiological explanation? The summit remains untouched, exactly as four separate religions have insisted it stay. From the mountain no one climbs, we travel to Bhutan, to the one site in this entire video where local tradition doesn't just warn about a presence on the mountain. It names exactly what was bound there, and where. Number 10. Paro Taktsang. You're climbing a narrow cliff path in Bhutan, 10,000 feet up, the monastery complex clinging to a sheer rock face above you like it grew directly out of the stone. Prayer wheels turn in the thin wind. Below, the valley drops away completely. Construction on the visible complex began in 1692. Built around a cave that Vajrayana Buddhist tradition holds was already sacred nearly 1,000 years earlier, when the teacher Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, arrived at this exact cliff face not by any ordinary route, but flying, according to the tradition, on the back of a tigress. The tigress wasn't an animal in the way that word usually means. Tradition specifies she was a wrathful Dakini, a powerful non-human female being from the Vajrayana cosmology, who had taken the physical form of a tiger specifically to carry the teacher across impassable terrain to reach this cliff. She is not described as a metaphor for speed or strength. She is described as a being who chose that shape for that purpose, and who is depicted in temple art at the site exactly as described, a tiger with something unmistakably aware behind its eyes. Once at the cave, Guru Rinpoche is said to have meditated for a precisely specified length of time, 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, and 3 hours, a duration repeated across the tradition's oral and written record, with consistency unusual for what mainstream scholars typically dismiss as embellished legend. The purpose of that meditation, according to the same tradition, was to subdue a group of local demons actively hostile to the arrival of Buddhism in the region, entities the tradition describes in specific physical terms and depicts consistently in the complex's own temple murals. Dark, muscular forms with multiple limbs and faces stacked in tiers up a single neck, eyes rendered wide open and fixed on the viewer from every angle of the room, skin painted in shades no natural pigment matches. Not abstract obstacles. Present, resisting, physically rendered beings, painted by people who insisted they were painting something they had reason to know. And critically, the tradition specifies he did not destroy them. He bound them into specific caves within the cliff complex itself, a distinction the tradition treats as deliberate and significant rather than incidental. Here's what makes monastic historians uncomfortable. Several of the complex's 13 sub-temples, built directly over these specific binding sites according to the monastery's own internal records, remain closed to all visitors today, monastic and lay alike. accessible only to a small number of designated caretaker monks operating on a strict, limited rotation. This isn't standard practice for the tradition. Most Vajrayana temple sites, even ones housing significant relics, permit at least restricted, lay access with proper ritual preparation. These specific sections don't. Local tradition attached to the site is explicit and consistent on one point. Nothing is to be removed from the sealed caves, and the binding sites are not to be disturbed, with consequences described as extending to the surrounding valley itself, not merely to the individual who disturbs them. In 1998, a fire severely damaged the main complex, and multiple monk accounts recorded in the aftermath describe the blaze originating near one of the sealed temple sections specifically, a detail preserved in local and monastic testimony, despite no official investigation ever conclusively identifying an electrical or accidental source for the ignition. Firefighting response at that altitude was limited by the cliffside structure itself, and several sections burned for hours before crews could reach them. Reconstruction restored the visible complex to its historic appearance, and the sealed sections were rebuilt exactly along their original footprint, closed again the moment reconstruction allowed it, with no changes made to which sub-temples remained restricted, and no public account from the reconstruction crews describing what, if anything, was found inside the damaged, sealed sections before they were closed again. Why does a tradition spanning over 1,000 years insist so consistently, across independent regional and monastic sources, that specific beings were bound rather than destroyed at this exact cliff? Why do the closed sub-temples map directly onto the location's tradition names as binding sites, restricted even to most monks living at the monastery itself? And why did a fire with no confirmed source begin precisely where the sealed sections stand? The cliff is still there, the prayer wheels still turn, and the cave's tradition says hold something bound rather than gone or still closed behind doors. Only a handful of caretakers are trusted to pass. 10 holy sites, 10 separate traditions spanning every inhabited continent, and the same pattern under every one of them. Not decay, not superstition, not coincidence, but something bound, sealed, or kept out of reach on purpose, by people who had every reason to know exactly what they were protecting the rest of us from. If this pattern followed your site the way it followed us, subscribe so you don't miss what we find next. Like this video if you think the official explanations have more locked doors than any textbook admits, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from.